What a great honor to be here with you at a time when First Nations children need you the most. Canada is turning 150 years old. That's a long time unless you are Inuit, First Nations, or Métis. The question is, what have we learned as a country? What has the government of Canada learned? What have we, the people of the period, learned? And how are we going to use that learning to change our choices? The day before Prime Minister Harper issued the apology to residential school survivors for the wrongs that were done to them, to the genocide that was done to them, I found myself in Beechwood Cemetery. In my hands were a bouquet of brightly colored Gerber daisies. They represented for me the joy of children. I didn't really know where I was going, but I walked by all the tall monuments. Maybe it's just me, but I think it doesn't help. If you have lived a scandalous life, you can build that thing 10 stories high. Real heroes need not shout. I found just in front of a tree, a naughty maple tree as it turns out, the place that I needed to go. I stood before the grave of Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, one of you. It's your story, at least part of your story. You see, Dr. Bryce was Canada's first medical health officer, wrote the first Canada's Health Code, and he was president of the American Public Health Association, founder of the Canadian Public Health Association, and many other accolades, and for that alone he should be remembered, but he's not. He's not remembered because he was a troublemaker. And what trouble did he get into? Well, that's exactly why I was there. You see, in 1907, he took up a post, or 1904, he took up a post as Canada's Chief Medical Health Officer at Indian Affairs. He went out and surveyed the health of the children in the residential schools. He found that 25% of the children were dying each year, and 50% died over 3 years. In one school, for every 3 children that walked in, only 1 walked out alive. And Dr. Bryce said this: medical science knows just what to do. He pointed out to the government of Canada they were spending more money on tuberculosis treatment just in the city of Ottawa, 3 times as much than they were spending on all First Nations across the country. He said with proper treatment, with equitable treatment, and with changes like not putting sick kids in with healthy kids, we could save these children's lives. And Canada's response, the government's response, $10,000 to $15,000 is too much money. We can't afford it. So what did Dr. Bryce do? Well, somehow his report in 1907, on November 15th, appears on the front page of the Evening Citizen, then the Ottawa Citizen, and shortly after that on the Globe and Mail, and in the Victoria Colonist and the Winnipeg Free Press. It documented the deaths of these children and the opportunity the government of Canada had to set it right. He was screaming out to all of us, the people of the period. He believed that we would do the right thing if we only knew. And some of us spoke up. Samuel Hume Blake, the founder of Blake's law firm, said that in that Canada fails to obviate the preventable causes of death, it brings itself into unpleasant nearness with manslaughter. But most of us were silent. We might have cared, but we didn't care enough to go and knock on our member of Parliament's door. We didn't want to create any trouble. And so the children died. The person on the other end was also a member of your church, the person who said, no, it costs too much money. His name was Duncan Campbell Scott. He headed up the Bureau of Indian Affairs for over 52 years, and I met him in high school literature class. You see, his loyal public service to the government was well remembered. He was given accolades and honorary doctorates and celebrated. When he retired, the government of Canada held a very large reception for him. And I, as a teenage girl, opened up that poetry book and read his poems about people like me, the savages that weren't supposed to be there anymore. I didn't think his poetry was very good back then. And I wondered why people celebrated him. But as for Dr. Bryce, in 1932, he dies in virtual anonymity. No one wants to remember him. He's erased from the Canadian story. On that day, in June of 2008, I told Dr. Bryce about the Canadian human rights complaint that we had filed against the government of Canada, alleging that their conscious and chronic inequitable funding of First Nations child welfare was driving First Nations kids into child welfare care at 3 times the rate of residential schools. That underfunding extended to education, to health, and to every basic social service. As one non-Aboriginal girl told me, she said, "Cindy, discrimination is when the government doesn't think you're worth the money." So imagine if you weren't worth the money, or your kids weren't worth the money, and you're being judged by a Canadian public that doesn't know any better as if you get more. The problem, the public thinks, is not about the inequities and the racial discrimination that First Nations children are still bearing underneath the weight. The problem is that we're not grateful enough for the generosity we've been offered. I told Dr. Bryce I would be back when the kids won the case. It took 8 years for me to fulfill that promise. The government of Canada fought that case on every legal technicality. It never wanted the truth to come out, and it never wanted you to hear it. Because at some level, the government of Canada believed, just as Bryce believed, that one day you would stir. You would start to see that the Confederate flag flies above Parliament just as high as a Canadian flag is, but we have been trained, as Gord Downey said, to our entire lives to look away from it. This is a government that funds things like the Canada Day celebration by racially discriminating against little kids. It was January 26th. The decision was going to come out, but I knew about it a couple of days earlier. After 9 long years, it arrived unceremoniously on an iPhone. I'm not sure what Bryce would have thought about that. I couldn't even open it. Time itself stood still. I couldn't hear anything. I couldn't even feel anything. And then I finally pressed that button. And the first line in that decision says, "This decision is about children." And I knew it was going to be okay. And the next one is about honoring the residential school survivors. And then the tribunal said Canada's racial discrimination is a continuance of the residential school program. The kids had won. But would Canada do the right thing, I wondered. I went back. I got my gumboots and my teddy bear. I spent a lot of time with bears, for those of you who don't know. And I went down to see Dr. Bryce. I placed my teddy bear on his gravestone. And there in the gumboots, in the cold cemetery with one track of footsteps, I looked back. And I knew that my boots had made those imprints, but I knew there were thousands of other people who were there too. Most importantly, those children who never made it out. And I read Dr. Bryce the decision, alone in that cemetery that day. And I said, "Justice, Dr. Bryce, finally justice." But Canada has not complied. The tribunal has issued 2 non-compliance orders against the Canadian state this last year alone, and another non-compliance order is coming. The challenge is still with you, the people of the period. What are you going to do? Are you prepared to get into as much trouble as Bryce to do the right thing? You know, just before Duncan Campbell Scott died, the closest thing to a lament appears in a letter that he writes to his publisher. It says, "I've never done anything courageous in my entire life." Duncan Campbell Scott is also buried in Beechwood. And one of the things I thought was important is to work with Bryce's family to erect a historical plaque, and I went to see Duncan Campbell Scott the day before the TRC's closing report. I wanted to make sure I had a good heart and mind before I went to that burial place. And as I stepped down, I realized he had a historical plaque as well. Talked about all the poetry he had written. I said to myself, that one needs a revision. You see, your legacies are not written by the obituary your friends write for you. Your obituary and your legacy is imprinted in the actions that you make every day. And so in November of 2016, I was honored to stand with the great historian John Malloy, Truth and Reconciliation Commissioner Marie Wilson, Charlene Barehead, Ed Bianchi from Kairos. And we made that revision to Duncan Campbell Scott's plaque. It now says, Confederate poet and cultural genocide. Two other turns of history you need to know. Nicholas Flood Davin is also buried there, and he will get his historic plaque on June the 4th. But history has an odd sense of humor. And for 52 years, as Duncan Campbell Scott toiled away in that office on Spark Street called the Booth Building, I wonder if he ever thought what the next tenants would bring. You know, like that house you've fallen in love with and you finally have to sell. That land that you're on and you wonder if they'll take as good care of it. Well, it took a number of years, but new tenants finally did move in to Duncan Campbell Scott's office. The Aboriginal People's Television Network. You have your choices in life. These were two members of your community, both white men of your faith, both confronted with the same problem. One was a moral coward, and for that he was richly rewarded in the short term. And one had the moral courage to stand up and do the right thing. I have one request for you and your church as people and as a church. I want you to get into a lot of trouble for doing the right thing, because discrimination is not polite. Thank you very much.